Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go. Hello and welcome to the weekly discussion on the explained section of Indian Express. The idea here is to take up topics that have not been already discussed or elaborately discussed in the DNS. Considering this, the topic that we have chosen for this week discussion are there on your screen. Let's begin.
The first explained article that we are going to take up in this session is this. What is NITI Aayog's draft national policy on migrant workers? See, NITI Aayog, after a wider consultation with many ministries, civil societies and international organizations like UN Habitat, has come up with a draft national policy on migrant workers. The perils of migrant workers came to the fore during lockdown, where millions of migrant workers had to walk back their home in difficult situation. According to the government data given by the Minister of State, Labour and Employment in the Parliament, 10 million labourers had to go back home during the lockdown. And this has brought attention to the issue of governance and administration related to welfare of migrant workers. First of all, according to International Organization for Migration, migrant is any person who moves away from his or her place of usual residence, whether within the country or across an international border, whether temporarily or permanent, for varied reasons. But in our discussion here, we'll be focusing only on internal migrants, or to be specific, interstate migrants. In India, we have large number of inter-district and inter-village migrants. According to Economic Survey of 2017, which discussed the issue in detail, there are around 7 million interstate migrants in India. The number of internal migrants as per 2011 census is very high. Around 455 million people, which is 37% of total population, are migrants. The difference in these two numbers are, the Economic Survey gave the data of interstate migrants, and 2011 census is actually giving the number for total number of internal migrants, which could be inter-district, inter-village as well. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh are the states which are the highest source of internal migrants in India, accounting for around 50% of total interstate migrants. 9 million is a huge number if we just consider interstate migrants. But the problem is not only of interstate migrants migrating within the state face similar challenges as interstate migrants, and that number is very high, 37% of total population. And that calls for a national policy on migrant workers. The draft national policy on migrant workers by NITI Aayog has a very important policy stand. The stand is, migration should be acknowledged as an integral part of development. In many developing countries, including India, people and the government have very negative view of migration. So far, the government's effort has been to stop migration. Explicitly and implicitly in the government policy, migration is seen as a problem, and efforts are being taken to generate employment, to provide facilities locally so that people do not migrate. But a changed policy stance is that migration should be acknowledged as an integral part of development. This is a very, very important point from the draft policy of NITI Aayog. Migrants are to be seen as agents of development and not a burden on the new place of living. In fact, back in 2017, there was a report given by Working Group on Migration. It was constituted by the then Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, and this committee in its report also argued that movement from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services was inherently linked to success of migration in the country. And we are also in the stage of transiting our human resource, our manpower, from agriculture towards manufacturing and further towards services. And internal migration will be a natural consequence of this transition. And it is going to be the integral part of the development story that other developing countries and India will see. This already has been seen in the growth story of Southeast and East Asian countries. The positive impact of internal migration in these countries have been recorded, and these countries, as a consequence of that, has seen reduction in poverty. Similarly, mobility, internal migration as a tool to reduce poverty and increase livelihood opportunity has been recorded in many countries in Africa. Migration, internal mobility has been seen to have multiplier effect in the economy and society. It not only results in remittances getting back to the source state, an increase in land and property value, increased urbanization in the destination state, but it also stimulates the labor market of the nation. It allows agricultural transition, opportunity for mechanization, reduction in manpower in agriculture sector. It also strengthens cooperation between the home and the host societies. There is dissemination of skill, the entrepreneurial spirit that people bring back home. There is cultural transmission, cultural diffusion to various parts of the country. And hence, it is observed and duly noted by the report of NITI Aayog that if there is control on population movement, then that is going to hamper the economic growth and poverty reduction process of the nation. So, the report says that government should not hinder but seek to facilitate internal migration. Although there is no barrier on internal migration in India, everybody, all citizens have right to freedom of movement under Article 19 of Indian Constitution, and as such everyone is free to work anywhere in India. But there are some natural and artificial barriers. And if those barriers are not removed, if the process of internal migration mobility is not facilitated, then the hindrances which are already there, they will be present. So government must actively remove these hindrances and facilitate internal mobility for the development of the country. So now we must discuss how that must be done. I have discussed this template previously while many discussions in the DNS. When you do a topic of governance, you can follow this template. It sorts things out and topics look simpler. Let's apply this template to discuss the governance related with issues of migrant workers. We will talk only what NITI Aayog has suggested, but we will organize in a manner that content fits into this template. First of all, for governance in any area, we need to have policy. Policy gives the vision, and it also gives the strategy to implement that vision. The strategy to implement the vision of welfare of migrant workers is a right-based approach that NITI Aayog has put forward. Right-based approach meaning citizens will not be seen as beneficiaries, they will not be just given the dole of financial help, but rather they will have their rights. The right to minimum wage, the right to safe and decent place of work, right against exploitation. But to ensure these rights, there is need for good governance, and good governance is strengthened, is motivated when there is political accountability. Political accountability can be ensured if people are politically inclusive. And one of the tools for that is to give people voting rights. Vote of citizen is a big bargain for good governance from the politicians. Migrant workers, as you would understand, do not have right to vote in the destination state. They cannot vote where they are working, and it is also very difficult to go back to their home for voting. So generally they have very little support from the host state and also from the home state. Apart from voting right, there is also a need for further and deeper political inclusion of migrant workers in the form of their involvement in preparation of citizen charter, social audit, and participation in local governance. This is a very important strategy for welfare of migrant workers. Ultimately, it is a political inclusion that gives a strength, that gives some bargaining power in the hands of citizens. And this is what NITI Aayog has advocated in the draft national policy on migrant workers. To give a concrete form to the vision of the policy which is implementable, there is need for legislation. So far, the major legislation for welfare of migrant worker is Interstate Migrant Workers Act 1979. But this legislation has been criticized heavily because it is designed to only protect the laborers, migrant workers, from exploitation by contractors. As per the Act, the contractors have to be non-discriminatory with regard to wages, with regard to travel and displacement allowances, and with regard to providing suitable working condition to all workers, including the migrant workers. But to get the benefit out of Interstate Migrant Workers Act 1979, the migrant workers should be recruited by licensed contractors. If they are working individually, then the law will not be applicable. And unfortunately, you would understand that most of the migrant workers will not be working under licensed contractors. Also, the Act is only applicable to those establishments which has 5 or more interstate migrant workers. So even in establishments having less than 5 migrant workers, the Act is not applicable. The report of Working Group on Migration that was constituted in 2017 and also the present draft of NITI Aayog calls for a comprehensive law for these workers. The present legislation of 1979 is very narrow in its application. So there's a need of new legislation to be brought in that will have provisions implementing the vision of the policy. The legislation in turn will be implemented by good administration. Good administration will require institutional capacity and infrastructure. Presently, the migrant workers are invisible population because they cannot enforce political accountability because they don't have political inclusion. Presently, the state labor departments, they have very little engagement with the issues of migrant workers. There is lack of human resource, there is lack of fund, and there is also lack of coordination among the ministries. There is absence of any administrative setup. So in order to set an administrative machinery that will look after the welfare of migrant workers, NITI Aayog's draft National Policy on Migrant Workers has suggested a structure. On the top, there will be nodal ministry, which will be Ministry of Labour and Employment. This nodal ministry will be coordinating with other ministries like Ministry of Panchayati Raj, Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. They must coordinate with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs to come up with a data on migration of tribal population. That will enable the efficient working of migration resource centers. Migration resource centers have been suggested by NITI Aayog to be opened up in high migration zones and migration corridors. Migration resource centers in coordination with other ministries like Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship can work on skill building of migrant workers. Similarly, Ministry of Education must take measures under Right to Education Act to mainstream migrant children's education and provide local language teachers to the migrants' destination. Also, Ministry of Labour itself in coordination with NALSA should set up a grievance handling cells that will fast-track legal responses for issues like trafficking, minimum wage violations, and workplace abuses, even accidents. So the nodal ministry, which is Ministry of Labour and Employment, it must carry out inter-ministerial coordination mechanism. And all these ministries in turn must have migration focal points in their working, in their policy design, etc. And the nodal ministry must have migrant workers cells, the central ministry and all the state ministries. This migrant workers cell will be the main body for coordinating, carrying out the function, welfare of migrant workers. It will coordinate with the working of interstate migration management bodies. All these are suggestive bodies, they do not exist. But in the draft policy, NITI Aayog has given a suggestive mechanism to carry out the administration regarding welfare of migrant workers. So under the nodal ministry of Ministry of Labour and Employment, there is a suggestion to have a migrant worker cell. And this migrant worker cell will coordinate with interstate migration management bodies, which is also to be established. Migrant worker cell will also coordinate with migration resource centers, will operate national labour helpline, will create awareness, link the worker's household to government schemes, will do the skill mapping, will coordinate with other central ministries to carry out education, to carry out skill development work, etc. etc. The migrant worker cells of one state will coordinate with the migrant worker cells of other states in order to have interstate coordination through the interstate migration management bodies. So this is the administrative setup that NITI Aayog envisaged. in the draft national policy on migrant workers. Unless we have this institutional setup, the legislation and the policy cannot be implemented. The administration regarding welfare of migrant workers cannot be done. Once we have the institutional structure, once we have institutional capacity, once we have funds, once we have functionaries, and we have the defined function, then only the administrative tools can be put in motion. The tool like data collection. Both the 2017 report and the present draft report by NITI Aayog, both of them stress on the need for credible data. Data on seasonal and circular migration. Data on migrant-specific variables like the age group, gender, caste, educational status, number of children, etc., etc. The main source of data related with migration is the census data, which comes once a decade. In 2017, Economic Survey made an estimation that was not a data collection from ground. The hard data is only the census data on migration. So the suggestion is that the Registrar General of India must release migration data at least once a year. And that data must not only be interstate, that data must be inter-district, at sub-district level, even at the village level. The periodic survey of National Sample Survey Office that must also include questions related to migration. Without data collection, the condition and the progress of migrant workers cannot be judged, and hence political accountability cannot be enforced. There is also a need of infrastructure development that will aid the administration of welfare of migrant workers. It is suggested that the source states must have some kind of contact points with the migrant workers. NITI Aayog has suggested that the labor officers from the source state can be deputed to the destination. The state of Bihar has experimented by appointing a joint commissioner in the Bihar Bhavan in New Delhi. This kind of joint mechanism of source and destination states can be used for the welfare of migrant workers. As we have discussed before, any initiative for good governance in any area cannot be successful without people's active participation involvement. On the issue related with migrant workers, first thing is there is a lot of negativity with regard to migrants in India. Migration still is perceived to be a negative thing, and efforts are channelized to stop migration. Migration is not seen as a tool for development. Migration is not perceived as an intrinsic part of the growth story of a nation. So first of all, this negative opinion related with migration must be reversed. People must be trained to adopt the culture of new places, to avoid any cultural conflict, to generate tolerance in general in society, so that local participation of migrant workers, whether in local governance or in the unions of the destination state, that can be facilitated. India has lakhs and lakhs of trade unions, but only a small minuscule of that are unions of migrant workers. That is also one form of political inclusion. And then, as we have learned before, in any area of governance, you must see how technology can come in aid to governance. In the beginning, we have talked about how voting right can be used for bargain from the politicians. Presently, it's difficult for migrant workers to exercise their right of voting because electronic voting is not common in India. And rightly so, there are risks of rigging of election if there is electronic voting. But using technology like blockchain, mechanism can be created where votes cannot be altered. This is just one technology. You can think of other technologies that can be used for the welfare of migrant workers. We will end from where we began. Migration should be acknowledged as an integral part of development, and government policies must not hinder but seek to facilitate internal migration. We need to adopt a strategy where development and internal migration can be synergized. The next article that we are going to take up is this: what rise in bond yield means for investors, government. Bond yield so far in this financial year had been kept well below 6%. But the 10-year bonds yield in India moved up more than 6% till 6.2% recently, when just 1 month is left for end of this financial year. Bond yield actually started to rise in United States, and then it was quickly followed in other developing countries, including India.
Increase in bond yield in India also coincided with the budget announcement, where the finance minister has pegged the fiscal deficit for the next financial year at 6.8%, which will gradually be brought down to 4.5% by 2025-26. Government has a plan of borrowing 12 lakh crore rupees from the market. There is already outstanding government security of 70.55 lakh crore, and more is going to be borrowed. However, the bond yield in United States have been brought under control now. In our discussion here, we'll try and understand how the rising bond yield affects government and the investors, and how in turn it itself gets affected by other macroscopic parameters. Let's begin to understand this piece by piece. First of all, bond yield very simplistically is the return that an investor gets on the bond that he or she has purchased. Suppose investor A buys a bond of rupees 100 and the coupon rate is rupees 5. And suppose this is a 10-year bond. This means that every year the investor A is going to get rupees 5 as interest, and at the end of 10 years, rupees 100, the principal, will be returned back. The interest rate that Mr. A is getting every year is rupees 5 on the investment of rupees 100, which means that the bond return rate is 5%, or the bond yield is 5%. Now suppose that Mr. A wants to sell off this bond. This financial decision that Mr. A is taking can come out of various reasons. One reason could be that Mr. A is getting jittery about the economy. He thinks that everything is going to be doomed, so better to hedge the loss. And suppose Mr. A wants to sell the bond at rupees 99. Everybody has different financial and economic outlook. There would be a buyer for this bond at rupees 99 because the buyer may look at things differently. And if Mr. A sells the bond to Mr. B, the buying rate for Mr. B is rupees 99. The coupon rate of the bond will remain the same, still rupees 5. So every year Mr. B now is going to get rupees 5, but the investment is only of rupees 99. Return will be higher, which in this case will be 5.05%. The bond yield for Mr. B has increased. The bond yield in general, if the bond starts to get sold off at lower price, will increase. If the bond price decreases, the bond yield increases. Remember this relation, bond yield is inversely proportional to bond price. Selling the bond at lower price could also come for other reasons. For example, Mr. A now see opportunity in investment elsewhere, where the return on investment is higher. The return on government securities are generally low because they are safe investment. If the economy starts to pick up, then investment in equities could be more lucrative. Investment in gold can give higher return, or investment in real estate, wherever. So for that reason also, Mr. A might want to sell off the bond at lower price, take away his money and invest somewhere else so that he makes more profit. But if for some reason the demand for government securities starts to increase, maybe the economy now is not doing well and investing in government securities is the safest choice. Suppose Mr. C purchases the bond from Mr. A at rupees 101. The coupon rate will still remain the same, rupees 5, and Mr. C will get an annual return of rupees 5 on an investment of rupees 101, which will be lower than 5%, 4.95%. But still not bad. For Mr. C, it is good enough, it is safe, economy is not doing well, and you are getting 4.95% return, it is good. So Mr. C will go for it. But if bond yield has decreased, you must take note that the bond price has increased. Bond price now is 101. Or to say otherwise, if the bond yield has decreased, the demand for the bond has increased. And can I say, if the bond yield has increased, that means the demand for the bond has decreased. That means the investors have other opportunities, other avenues for investment. By extrapolation, can I also say that economy now has started to do well. Understand this. RBI releases government securities, raises money for the government. This is done in the primary market. Investors come to the primary market and purchases government securities. Securities are given by the process of bidding. The one that bids for lowest bond yield, securities are given to them. Investors purchase government security from primary market and go to the secondary market and sell them off to retail investors. This is what investors do. They are not here to purchase 10 years bond to hold it for 10 years and just earn 5% of whatever interest on that. They are here to make quick money. They will buy it from primary market, sell it off in the secondary market. That's how they make quick money. This is mostly done by foreign institutional investors. They are not going to stay in the market for long. What happened recently in the US after the rollout of vaccine, economy was beginning to come on track. US economy showed sign of recovery and investors got elated. They wanted to invest in the economy. They wanted to give money to the corporates, earn higher return. Because the interest rate in the government bonds in the treasury bills of US would be very, very low. So the money will now go to the market at the cost of government. So the treasury bill that the Fed, the central bank of US, was releasing will have less takers now. Because the money gone from the bond market to the equity market, to the stock exchanges, money will be now given to the corporates. Money can also now be given in the form of venture capital, angel funding, or in the real estate. Because of lesser demand in the primary market, the bond price will decrease. It's basically fund of demand supply. Demand has decreased for the bond, so the prices will fall down. If the bond price decreases, meaning the bond yield will increase. So the bond yield started to increase in US when the economy began to come back on track. But the thing is, economy began to come back on track because of higher expenditure by the US government. Higher expenditure essentially means now the government will have to borrow more. Meaning US government will have to request to the Fed to release more government securities. But the bond yield now has increased, meaning the effective rate of return on those bonds have increased. Now when the Fed will release the bonds in primary market, auctioning will be done, and the auctioning will be done as per the prevailing bond yield in the market. Or to see it other way around, when the auctioning will be done by the Fed, there are less takers, there is less demand. So the Fed will have to offer higher bond yield. So the US government will have to pay higher interest rate. Borrowing for the US government will now become expensive. That is why increased bond yield in the US market becomes a big news. Now let's see what happened in India. When the bond yield in US increased, that means that the market of US is doing pretty well. That means that the FII who came to India when the economy was down in US will go back like flies to the US market. Since the bond yield has increased now, they can also invest in the US government bond, the treasury bills. So the hot money that came through FII now is going to just fly. So the takers of government securities now released by RBI will be less. And also the investors who were in Indian market, in the stock market, in NSE, in BSE, they are also now going to go away. That is why when the bond yield in US increased, that resulted in slump in the Sensex and also Nifty. There was almost a crash in Indian stock market because FII took the money and went back. Although the stock market now has recovered and is heading towards a fresh high, it's a different issue because DII, domestic institutional investor, started to invest in stock market as FII, foreign institutional investor, went back. But this is the link. When the yield in US market increases, money goes back to the US. And you also understand that the fiscal deficit forecast in the budget is high. Government borrowing is high. Government is now planning to borrow 12 lakh crore. Which means that the RBI will be flooding many government securities in the primary market. So because of higher supply of government securities, the prices again is going to go down. If the demand decreases, prices decreases. If the supply increases, prices will again decrease. Simple demand supply funda. Now understand the investor who is holding the bond right now knows it very well that the market will be flooded by government security and the prices will go down. So even before the RBI has actually flooded government security in the market, the investor will sell off the bond. Just like if you know that there has been bumper harvest and the crop is still in the field, but ultimately it's going to come to the market. And when so much of crop will come to the market, the prices will decrease. So the wholesaler, whatever amount is holding, will quickly sell off the bond. The same thing will happen here. Because of the budget forecast, immediately after the budget, the investors started to sell off the bond, obviously at lower price. So the bond prices started to decrease. That means the bond yield will increase. So the bond yield in Indian market also started to increase. And hence we saw in the beginning When the bond yield in the United States started to increase, that was quickly followed by other emerging economy including India. And bond yield in India touched 6.2%. So now you also understand that the bond yield is dependent on fiscal position of government. It is also dependent on global market. We discussed in the beginning that when bond yield is increasing, that is a signal of economy doing well, because now the buyer of government bond are less, meaning they have other opportunities in the market, so the market must be doing well. If the market is doing well, economy will be in the run, then the inflation will increase. And if inflation increases, then the monetary policy of the central bank have to be adjusted such that rising inflation is arrested, which means that the policy rate will have to be increased. If policy rate is increased, it will become even more difficult for the government to borrow. Government will be forced to flood the primary market with more government securities. That will decrease in even higher bond yield. If the policy rate is decreased, then the borrowing will be eased. The government will be less dependent on borrowing from the market. Supply of government security will decrease and the increasing bond yield can be arrested. RBI cannot decrease the policy rate. When the economy is performing very well, there is very high risk of inflation, and inflationary pressure on Indian economy has not decreased. When inflation remains high, policy rate cannot be cut. Without cutting the policy rate, we'll have to look for ways and means to decrease the bond yield. And that is done through a special open market operation, sometimes referred to as Operation Twist. Generally, what happens in open market operation is RBI sell or buy the government securities. When it sells the government security, it pumps out money from the market. It pumps in money to the market. But in the special open market operation, Operation Twist, RBI purchases long-term government securities and sells short-term government securities simultaneously. When RBI sells short-term government security, RBI gets money. With that money, RBI purchases long-term government security. So two parallel open market operations happen simultaneously, and the net effect is this, that RBI is selling short-term government security and buying long-term government security. When RBI is buying long-term government security, then the supply of long-term government security in the market will decrease. When the supply decreases, you would understand that the bond price will increase. And if the bond price increases, the bond yield would decrease. This is what we wanted, to decrease the bond yield of long-term government security to less than 6%. But however, since RBI is selling short-term government security, so there will be increase in supply of short-term government security. When there is increased supply, there will be decrease in the price. If bond price decreases, the bond yield will increase. But that is okay, because when the government is going to borrow to finance the fiscal deficit, it is going to be done through long-term government security. So the bond yield of long-term G-Secs is more important. So before the government started to borrow, before RBI floated government security in the market, it was important that the bond yield of long-term government security be decreased. Otherwise, the government will have to pay higher interest rate for borrowing. And that goal has been achieved through Operation Twist. This is the motive of Operation Twist. But you might be thinking that the bond yield of long-term government security could have been simply decreased by purchasing them. Why did you sell short-term government security? Because this way there is no net injection of money or pumping out of money. RBI has neither increased nor decreased the money supply. So there will be no inflationary effect on the economy. That is what we intended to do. We didn't want to decrease the repo rate. We didn't want to change any other policy rate. We did not want to have any inflationary effect on the economy and yet decrease the bond yield of long-term government security, which was important to do, and we have done it because the fiscal deficit this financial year, 9.5%. Government is to borrow 12 lakh crore rupees. And if the bond yield would have been increased, RBI also would have to offer higher yield to the investors for the new government securities. And that would mean higher borrowing cost for the government. When the bond yield of long-term government security increases, then the investors also demand higher yields on corporate bonds. So the borrowing cost for the corporates will also automatically increase. And as we have discussed before, when the bond yield increases, investors go from the equity market to the debt market. The money go from the stock market to the bond market. And this has adverse impact on the equity market, on the stock exchanges. As we saw a rapid fall in the Sensex and Nifty as the bond yield in US and India started to increase. It is important that the stock market function well because there the retail investors, you and me, can invest very easily. Banks also link their interest rate with the long-term government security yield. As the yield increases, the interest rate increases, and hence there is decrease in the credit creation in the economy. So it is the long-term government security yield that must be checked, and that is what is done exactly by Operation Twist without impacting economy in any other way.
The next explained article that we are going to pick concerns Imran Khan's visit to Sri Lanka. The next article that we are going to pick is concerning Imran Khan's visit to Sri Lanka. This was the first head of the government's visit to Sri Lanka after the lockdown period, and this was the second visit of Imran Khan in the neighborhood after Afghanistan. So this bonhomie between Pakistan and Sri Lanka is raising some speculation and what plausible implication it can have on India's geostrategic interest in the neighborhood. We shall discuss that. First of all, although not very important for examination, we shall see Pakistan-Sri Lanka relation. That will help put things in context. We can have a sense as to how strong this relation can become. Pakistan and Sri Lanka have good trade relation. Pakistan is Sri Lanka's second largest trading partner in South Asia after India. The two nations also have free trade agreements since 2005, and recently they have decided to reactivate a joint working group to resolve the technical issues in the trade agreement. The two countries also have ties on cultural level. Pakistan has been trying to connect with Sri Lanka, highlighting its ancient Buddhist connections and ancient Buddhist sites in Pakistan. But the most important relation perhaps is that of defense. After 1987 India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord, India decided to send India Peacekeeping Force in Sri Lanka to keep LTTE in check. But very soon, India Peacekeeping Force discovered itself to be embroiled in fight with LTTE. That caused a lot of backlash in Sri Lanka, and India pulled it off in 1990. Ever since, very strong military ties does not exist between India and Sri Lanka. Although intelligence sharing happens at some level, but strong military tie was not re-established. And that vacuum was filled by Pakistan. In fact, towards the last stage of war in 2008-9, Sri Lanka turned to Pakistan for arms and ammunition as well as training of its fighter pilots. In 2008, present President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was then the Defense Secretary, rushed to Pakistan to have emergency assistance and military supplies. The war with LTTE ended in 2009. Also during the 1971 War of Liberation of Bangladesh, Pakistani jets used to get refueled in Sri Lanka. Pakistan sees to it that very important officers are sent to Sri Lanka as envoys. So the relationship of Pakistan and Sri Lanka is quite strong. And the recent visit of the Prime Minister of Pakistan has raised some concern among India's geostrategic think tanks. India has been trying its best to isolate Pakistan in regional and global forums. So it's not pleasing to see that Islamabad has a friend in the neighborhood. Although there is no threat as such of presence of Pakistan in Sri Lanka, Pakistan is a very minor player in the Indian Ocean region. The very extent it can go is to indulge in radicalization in certain regions in Sri Lanka. And India has raised concern regarding this before. The larger concern of India emerges out of a possible Sri Lanka, China and Pakistan triangle. Using Pakistan, Sri Lanka can be embroiled in the great game of China in the region. First of all, Sri Lanka is already part of Belt and Road Initiative. Sri Lanka has given major infrastructure project to China, including the operation of Hambantota port for 99 years. Sri Lanka has also overturned a tripartite agreement among Sri Lanka, India and Japan to develop Colombo's East Container Terminal. Sri Lanka has been planning expansion of Colombo Harbour. The plan is to develop the extension of Colombo Harbour, and 3 terminals are part of it: the East Terminal, South Terminal and West Terminal. The South Terminal is already ready and is operational since 2013. India and Japan was to develop this East Container Terminal. But the Rajapaksa government has decided to cancel it out, and they are offering India and Japan to develop West Terminal. No work has been started in West Terminal yet, and some of the work already started in the East Terminal. The concern is this has been done by the Sri Lankan government at behest of Chinese. So in this larger influence of China, the relation of Sri Lanka with Pakistan must be seen. Another lens of looking at the incident is to look at it from the vantage point of Sri Lanka trying to balance things out among the neighbors, because Sri Lanka is in dire need of support from the neighbors. In 2015, a resolution was brought in UN by UNHRC, and that was co-sponsored by Sri Lanka. The resolution is famously called as Resolution 31. According to the terms of resolution, Sri Lanka was to carry out investigation into alleged war crimes during the fight with LTTE. UNHRC prepared a report in which it reprimanded the army of Sri Lanka of human rights violations. Independent inquiry was to be conducted regarding this with foreign arbitrators and judges. At that point in time, Sri Lanka agreed. At that point in time, there was different government. That government agreed with the resolution, but the Rajapaksa government in 2020 has decided to withdraw from the resolution. But now the resolution is again going to come up. That has been co-sponsored by UK, US after showing the intention of joining UNHRC again, has reiterated that it will be part of sponsoring resolution against Sri Lanka concerning this particular resolution. So Colombo now in a fix is trying to be friends with everyone. So even when Sri Lanka abruptly withdrew from the tripartite agreement, it offered India and Japan a higher stake while developing this terminal that was not being offered in the East Container Terminal. And perhaps cancellation of East Container Terminal for India and Japan was done at behest of China, trying to be friends with India and Japan and also Pakistan. And Sri Lanka also has openly awarded a contract to a Chinese company to set up hybrid renewable energy in an island of Jaffna. India has to have a close watch on the warming relation between Sri Lanka and Pakistan. If it is issue-based cooperation, temporary and transitionary, that is okay. But if that is going to turn into defense cooperation and military strategy sharing, building a triangle with China, then India must keep its card ready. India has a stronger influence in Sri Lanka, and that influence still continues. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, was supposed to address the Parliament of Sri Lanka, but this was cancelled in the 11th hour. It is being speculated that this was done on behest of India. India also back in 2016 successfully pressurized Sri Lanka to drop a plan to buy Chinese JF-17 Thunder aircraft, which was being developed in Pakistan. Sri Lanka is bound by its geography. Sri Lanka has to cooperate with India. But it is up to India as to how this cooperation can be leveraged for peace and prosperity in the region. We'll do an article now on caracals. Recently, the National Board for Wildlife and Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change have included caracals in the list of critically endangered species. This is being done under Species Recovery Program run by National Board for Wildlife in association with Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Species Recovery Program is actually one component under the Integrated Development of Wildlife Habitat Program. There are three components under Integrated Development of Wildlife Habitats. One is concerning conservation of protected areas. The other is related with protection of wildlife outside protected areas. And the third is the recovery program for saving critically endangered species and habitats. Initially, 17 species were brought under Species Recovery Program. In 2018, 4 more were added. The number went up to 21. And now, after inclusion of caracals, the final number of a species under Species Recovery Program is 22. The exercise that you must do is to find the IUCN conservation status of all these 22 wildlife species. Caracal is an elusive, difficult to find wildcat because they are nocturnal. They are active mostly during nights. So their sighting is not very common, and a detailed study has not been done on these wildcats. So their numbers, distribution, habitat, these things are not very well known. But according to some estimation, the number of caracals surviving in India is less than 50. Caracals have some distinct physical feature. They have long legs, short face, long canine teeth, and a distinctive ear and distinctive ears. The ears are long and pointy, and they have tufts of black hair towards the tip. The ear has 27 muscles. The eardrum is long and sensitive. The caracals can listen to any foot movement of even smaller animals. Caracals are very swift, very fast, and they have extraordinary ability to catch birds in flight. Caracals have been used in ancient and medieval times as coursing animal. Coursing animals are those that are being used for chasing, for some kind of game or sports. And that perhaps is the reason why caracals were widely distributed in India, as north as Ladakh, as east as Bengal. But more recently, caracals were found to be distributed in 9 states in India. But the present day population habitat of caracal is restricted to 3 states: Rajasthan, the Kutch region of Gujarat, and some parts of Madhya Pradesh. Because of habitat destruction and destruction of associated prey of caracals, which are mostly rodents, their numbers are declining in Asia. But however, in Africa, they are doing just fine. And that is why the IUCN status of caracals is least concern. Caracals have been distributed in Indian subcontinent since ancient time. There are evidence of caracals in India from the fossil study dating back to Indus Valley civilization. There are also references showing that Firoz Shah Tughlaq used to have a stubble that housed a large number of caracals. Caracals also have mention in Abul Fazl's Akbarnama and various other medieval literature like Tutinama. Caracal is an important fauna in news, and you must add it to the list of fauna that you have been preparing for the prelims exam. Yes, I assume that you are preparing the list. We will take up now this article on COVAX and do some prelims pointer regarding this. This article appeared in the paper in the context of Ghana getting the first shipment of vaccine under the COVAX facility. COVAX, first of all, stands for COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access, and it is mainly led by the Vaccine Alliance Gavi, World Health Organization, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI. And then there are other partners like UNICEF, vaccine manufacturers, World Bank, and even other agencies of UN. But mainly it is led by 3 organizations: Gavi, WHO, and CEPI. Gavi, this is a vaccine alliance that was created in 2000. The purpose was to bring together public and private sectors, and it had a shared goal of creating equal access to new and underused vaccines for children living in world's poorest countries. It is of course a body outside UN. It has some core partners that include WHO, UNICEF, World Bank, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, was founded in 2017. The purpose was to develop vaccine to stop future epidemics. The focus was on new emerging infections. You must know that it was founded by government of Norway and India, along with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and World Economic Forum. So these three bodies, Gavi, WHO and CP, they are leading COVAX. And COVAX is one of the three pillars of ACT Accelerator. ACT here stands for Access to COVID-19 Tools. It is the most comprehensive global cooperation to reduce the acuteness of COVID-19 pandemic. The purpose was to accelerate the development, production and equitable access to three pillars: COVID-19 tests, treatments and vaccines. And under this third pillar of vaccine, the platform COVAX has been created. The aim of COVAX is to ensure equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines globally, to overcome the initial tendencies shown by developed nations to have vaccine nationalism, meaning making effort to produce and procure vaccines for your own citizens. But interestingly, nobody is safe unless everybody is safe. That's the nature of infectious diseases. So it was important to have a global administrative structure to deal with COVID-19 pandemic. And what's very important in that is equitable access of vaccines. The countries which cannot afford to fully pay for the vaccine, they must also have their due shares. The funds under COVAX have been mostly raised by developed nation. Developed nation actually will also benefit from this. Because of the global cooperation, the process of vaccine development will be accelerated. And because of equitable distribution of vaccine, developed nation will also benefit from global immunity against the virus. With this, we have come to the end of the session. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye. Take care.